Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Hello, everybody. Today is January 6th, and today is history in the making. Today, the Electoral College votes are formally read in the Senate by the President of the Senate, who is also the present Vice President of these United States, Mike Pence. My name is Mark David Smith, and you're watching Contemplating the Constitution on the Lamb Video Network. Now, for our Constitution in the news, when the Constitution of the United States shows up in the news. Periodically, I get an email from my North Carolina Congressman, David Rouser. I got this one last January 4th, and the email subject title was, Why I Will Be Objecting to Electoral Votes Cast by Certain States January 6th. I want to start this news segment off by reading the email I got from my congressman. I'll read it throughout this broadcast or this news part of the broadcast and insert my comments and some quotes from different publications along with parts of the Constitution as we go along. Congressman David Rouser starts off by saying, Dear friend, confidence in a presidential election has never been lower. With 39% of the country in a recent Reuters poll believing this election was rigged, there are just too many aspects of concern, too many irregularities, and clear violations of the U.S. Constitution by several of the states in question, which is why so many instinctively have little confidence that the presidential election was fair. The Constitution clearly states that it is the state legislatures that set election law, not governors, state boards of election, state Supreme Courts, or other actors, as we know in the case of these United States. The congressman is speaking about Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution that says, and I quote, the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for two persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. And they shall make a list of all the persons voted for, and of the number of votes for each which they list. They shall sign and certify and transmit, sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. This article was modified by the 12th Amendment. Listen while I compare the two. The original clause, the original article, said the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for two persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. Now, the modified 12th Amendment version says the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same states with themselves. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president. Now, going on with the original article, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, and they shall make a list of the persons voted for and the vote of the number of votes for each which list they shall sign and certify and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. Now, the modified 12th Amendment says, and they shall make distinct lists of all persons voted for as president and of all persons voted for as vice president, and of the number of votes for each, which list they shall sign and certify and transmit, sealed to the President of the Government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The next section of the 12th Amendment was not modified, but it adds a lot more details into which I won't go into today, but will expound on when we get to that section of the Constitution. Here on Contemplating the Constitution, the 23rd Amendment, also modified Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, but really goes into details on how the District of Columbia works on this electoral college vote. My North Carolina congressman goes on to say, the late changes made to election laws in these states affect the entire country in the presidential election. Disenfranchising voters from other states as well as their own, where the statewide laws were changed for some counties and not others. I have a hard time believing our founders intended for Congress to be a simple rubber stamp of approval for electoral college votes put forward by the respective states. I certainly agree that Congress' role should be as limited as possible. But if the founders intended a rubber stamp of approval, then why didn't they give this responsibility to an office of the executive branch or an office in the legislative branch? When more than a third of the American public believe this election was stolen, transparency and truth argue for their opportunity to be heard. I agree the voters of each state should decide, but that is the very point. How do we know legitimate voters actually decided it? Congress has dealt with voting issues before the presidential elections, which is why the Electoral Count Act of 1887 is law, even yet still today. The law allows for objections and debate of electoral college votes certified by a state, as we just read in the Constitution, provided that at least one House member and one senator object. Certainly, this should only be used in exceptional cases. I would argue this is such an occasion, and it certainly isn't the first time when it's been employed. I will cover more of that as we go along with this article. I'm going to step away from David's email now and give you some structural background on the Electoral College and how it worked through the 2020 elections right up to today, January 6th. Today, the Electoral College consists of a total of 538 members, one for each U.S. senator and representative, and 3 additional electors representing the District of Columbia. Each state legislator is free to determine the method it will use to select its own electors. Currently, all states select electors through a popular vote. To find out more on how all this works, you can find a special episode of Contemplating the Constitution concerning the Electoral College on the LAM website. In an article from ncsi.org titled The Electoral College Progression Overview, the following is a summary of how the Electoral College worked in the 2020 presidential election. Spring and summer 2020, we had the nomination of electors. The political parties in each state nominated their electors. The parties want to be sure they can rely on their electors to cast their votes for the party's nominee for president. And may I just interject on this, that the electors, the members of the Electoral College do not have to vote based on the popular vote for that state. They do not. They can elect not to vote that way. They have the legal right to do so. But when, once again, like I just said, in the spring and summer 2020, they had the nomination of electors, and the political parties in each state nominated their electors. hoping and choosing them specifically for their loyalty to the party. November 3rd, 2020 was election day, when voters in each state selected their presidential electors. The names of electors are not on the ballot in most states. When a voter casts a vote for presidential candidate, she is also casting a vote for the electors already selected by the party of that candidate. That's if the electors are not on the ballot. In some states, they are. If a majority of voters in a state vote for the Republican candidate for president, the Republican slate of electors is elected. If a majority vote for the Democratic candidate, the Democratic slate of electors is chosen. On December 8th, 2020, it was the deadline for resolving election disputes. All states' recounts and court contests over presidential election results must be completed by this date. For the majority of states, the date of certification is the same as for all contests. In 8 states, there is a deadline requiring that disputes surrounding the selection of presidential electors be resolved in time to meet the safe harbor deadline. Now, back on December 14th, 2020, they had the meeting of electors. The electors meet in each state and cast their ballots for president and vice president, according to the article we talked about earlier in the Constitution. Each elector votes on his or her own ballot and signs it. The ballots are immediately transmitted to various people. One copy goes to the President of the U.S. Senate, who is also the Vice President of the United States, currently Mike Pence. This is the copy that will be officially counted later. Other copies go to the state's Secretary of State, the National Archives and Records Administration, and the presiding judge in the district where the electors meet. This serves as a backup copy that would replace the official copy sent to the President of the Senate if it is lost or destroyed. On December 23rd, 2020, it was the deadline for receipt of ballots. The electors' ballots from all states must be received by the President of the Senate by this date. By the way, there is no penalty for missing this deadline. Today, January 6th, 2021, we have the counting of the electoral ballots. The U.S. Congress meets in joint session to count the electoral ballots. January 20th, coming up, 2021, is Inauguration Day. The president-elect becomes the president of the United States. Per an article from usatoday.com titled, "Congress is set to certify Biden's election when January 6th, here's what to expect." This is from that article. What is the procedure for the count? Members of the House of Representatives and U.S. Senate will meet in a joint session at 1 p.m. in the House chamber. The procedures for the session come from the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which I mentioned earlier and is still applicable for today. Vice President Mike Pence will preside in his role as President of the Senate. Leaders of both parties will appoint lawmakers from both chambers to serve as tellers. A teller is a person who counts the votes in an election, vote, referendum, or poll. Tellers are also known as scrutineers, poll watchers, challengers, or checkers. They should be distinguished from polling agents and counting agents who officially represent candidates. Pence will open certificates of the electoral votes from each state whose electors meet and cast their ballots on December 14th. Had cast their ballots on December 14th, and hand them to the tellers to read aloud. As they read a state's certificate, Pence will call for objection to the state's votes. This happens for each state as each state reads their votes, their certificates of electoral votes. Objections must be made in writing and endorsed by at least one member of both the House and Senate. Any objection that meets that criteria will result in a suspension of the joint session. The debate on each objection is limited to 2 hours. Each member may only speak for 1 5-minute stint, at which time the House and Senate will convene separately to consider the issue. Afterwards, the House and Senate will vote. A simple majority in both chambers is required to uphold the objection and throw out the state's votes. Short of that, the objection is disposed of and the state's electoral votes are counted as cast. Rebecca Green, an election law expert at the William and Mary School of Law, told USA Today that the sole purpose of this convening is for Congress to determine which ballots are the ballots that were certified by the states. This is not a trial where Congress will look at evidence of fraud in the election, Green said. There are no witnesses, there are no evidence presented, and there's a very limited opportunity to speak for that reason. To go on with the article, after all votes are counted, it falls to Pence to declare the winner of the election. So far, Pence, who has not acknowledged that Trump lost his bid for re-election, has remained relatively quiet on his role in the electoral vote count process. On December 28th, Republicans, including Texas Representative Louis Gohmert, filed a lawsuit in federal court to authorize Pence to pick and choose which electoral votes to accept or reject. Believe it or not, that's actually happened. In filing on December 31st, Pence asked the judge to dismiss the suit, which his brief called a walking legal contradiction. Of course it is. I'll go on to explain that in a little bit. Legal experts have also predicted the suit will fail, saying it is based on a far-fetching premise that the Constitution affords the president complete authority to decide an election. It does not. I actually went and researched that the best I could, and the Constitution does not give the vice president authority, any authority, whether complete or limited, to decide an election. Excuse me. In an article from the StarTribune.com that speaks of Pence's power during the January 6th count of the Electoral College, Cass R. Sunstein answers the question, and I quote, "What is he permitted to do on Wednesday?" Speaking, of course, of the vice president. Under the law, the simplest answer is not very much. His role is largely ceremonial. He has no power to overturn the results of a presidential election. A central reason is that the drafters of the U.S. Constitution and those who followed them were acutely aware of the risk of bias and self-interest in politics. They did not want the vice president, who might well have a rooting interest, to settle the outcome of a presidential election. For this week's congressional vote, there are two principal sources of law. The first is the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which is established and used today. The second is the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is established and used today, I read earlier. The law was explicitly designed to ensure that disputed issues would generally be settled by state authorities. It was written to make Washington much quieter and to reduce the risk of partisan wrangling. Under the statute, the vice president will be the presiding officer on Wednesday, but he won't have a lot to do. The outcome is supposed to be settled by certificates of the electoral votes that come from the states. Once again, we have Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2. Along with the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The USA Today article goes on to ask, will there be any objections? Multiple House represented Republicans have indicated that they will object to some states' electoral votes, citing alleged electoral fraud. You might remember I started this off by reading an email from my North Carolina representative. So he is also one of them. So Representative Mo Brooks, a Republican from Alabama, has led the charge. He and other conservatives met with Trump and Pence at the White House on December 21st to discuss the effort. After the meeting, Representative Jody Hice, Republican from Georgia, and Representative Brian Babin, Republican from Texas, announced that they plan to object to electoral votes. Others have also committed to object to votes. Representative Mo Brooks, Republican from Alabama, said on Fox and Friends, and I quote, "There are plans by dozens of House members to challenge the results in at least 6 states. We're going to sponsor and co-sponsor elections to the Electoral College vote returns of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and maybe more, depending on where we collectively want to go," unquote. Top Senate Republicans, including Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, have discouraged their members from backing objections to electoral votes. McConnell, who himself has recognized President-elect Biden, told colleagues that an objection isn't in the best interest of everybody, according to a report from the Hill. Nonetheless, Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, announced on December 30th that he plans to raise an objection to electoral votes in at least one state, Pennsylvania. And I quote Senator Hawley, "I cannot vote to certify the Electoral College results on January 6th without raising the fact that some states, particularly Pennsylvania, failed to follow their own state election laws," unquote, Hawley wrote on Twitter. It's possible that some, but not all, of the objections raised by the members of the House will obtain the backing of a senator, which, if you remember, it has to have the backing of at least one senator and one House representative from that state. Each objection that receives both will elicit its own 2-hour debate and vote, potentially turning the meeting into a marathon affair. This article also asks the question, have there been objections before? According to the article from the StarTribune.com, in the 58 presidential elections held since 1789, only 3 presidents have been elected after the regular Electoral College process is played out, but at least 3 of them have. So there is history for this. There's precedent for this. The 1800 and 1824 elections were contingent elections in Congress after no candidate won a majority of Electoral College votes, and a special 15-person commission decided the dispute on the 1876 election. In 1837, the Senate also decided a vice president race in a contingent election. In recent times, the Supreme Court ruling on Bush versus Gore, now we all remember this, in 2000, settled a controversy over an automatic recount in Florida that gave George Bush a majority of votes heading into the Electoral College proceedings that December. At times, members of the House have attempted to raise objections without support from the Senate. In 2017, half a dozen House Democrats objected to electoral votes for Trump. Half a dozen House Democrats, citing voter suppression and potential interference from Russia, which we all found out actually came from their side. But I digress. But Biden, then vice president and president of the Senate, then repeatedly slammed his gavel and rejected the effort since they lacked a senator sponsor. It is over, he said, quote unquote, to applause from Republicans. In 1969 and 2005, there were objections that met the criteria to require the House and Senate to debate and vote. In 1969, the objection was over an elector from North Carolina who voted for George Wallace instead of Richard Nixon. It was rejected by both chambers. In 2005, the objection was over electoral votes in Ohio cast for George Bush. I personally say, welcome to America. Welcome to these great United States of America. As the article goes on, couldn't objections succeed this year? I personally say, based on all that I've researched, it ain't over till they hear the objections. Another question asked in the USA Today article, if all 6 planned objections from the House received support from a member of the Senate, total debate time could exceed 12 hours. Speaking to Politico, Representative Mo Brooks, the Republican from Alabama, predicted that the proceedings will last even longer, clocking in at approximately 18 hours. If that's the case, the meeting will wrap up sometime on tomorrow, January 7th, and at long last end the presidential election. Now, I know this has been long, but I hope it's been interesting. Now, let me finish with the last bit said by my North Carolina Congressman, David Rouser. The American people need clarity. The American people need clarity that this election was fair and truly reflective of the will of the people. Unfortunately, the electoral and judicial processes so far have not provided for a thorough vetting. Congress is the last forum for the arguments to be heard in the short term. For these reasons, I will be objecting to the Electoral College votes certified by the states in question and believe the idea proposed by Senator Cruz and other members of the Senate to immediately appoint an electoral commission to do a 10-day audit of the votes cast would, if nothing else, help restore confidence in our elections moving forward. It is not seditious to follow the Constitution, the law, and the process laid out by the Electoral College Act. I recognize that there are others who read the Constitution and the law who come to a different conclusion, that the role of Congress should always be very limited with no question of the certified votes of a respective state. There are others that believe this. And my congressman goes on to say, I respect their viewpoint, but disagree. Our founders argued over such foundational issues as well. The American people will never have full confidence in another presidential election again without a full vetting of this one, so that the truth, whatever election results that it proves, can be known to all. At a minimum, perhaps this debate will compel states to clean up their acts, just as the hanging Chad debacle in the year 2000 compelled Florida to do so. I'm Mark David Smith, and I want to thank my North Carolina Congressman, David Rouser, for his, sorry the pun, rousing email. And I want to thank the usatoday.com, the startribune.com, and the Constitution of these United States. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was interesting to you. Now, on with Contemplating the Constitution.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Hello, I'm Mark David Smith, and you're watching Contemplating the Constitution. Last week, we talked about Article 1, Section 9, Clause 5. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. We talked about tax in general, duty tax, harbor maintenance tax, and stamp duty tax. This week, we will talk about Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6, which states, no preference shall be given to any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. The no preference clause was designed to prevent preferences between ports because of their location in different states. Discriminations between individual ports are not prohibited. Acting under the Commerce Clause, referring to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian. You can find my research on this article on the LAM Network website. Acting under the Commerce Clause, Congress may do many things that benefit particular ports and that incidentally result to the disadvantage of other ports in the same neighboring states. It may establish ports of entry, erect and operate lighthouses, improve rivers and harbors, and provide structures for the convenient and economical handling of traffic. As an example, a rate order of the Interstate Commerce Commission that allowed an additional charge to be made for ferrying traffic across the Mississippi to cities on the east bank of the river was sustained over the objection that it gave an unconstitutional preference to ports in Texas. Although there were a few early indications that this clause was applicable to the states as well as to Congress. The Supreme Court declared emphatically in 1886 that state legislation was unaffected by it. After more than a century, the court confirmed the first Congress had the power to exercise the sanctioning of the continued supervision and regulation of pilots by the states. That would be pilots of ships, by the way. Here are basic explanations of the Export and Port Preference Clause, which is the one we're on today, Clause 6, from barban.wordpress.com. So explanation of export preference means export preference forbids Congress from passing any laws that would favor the trade of one state over another. The clause prevents the powerful commercial faction from using the legislator to injure a politically weaker rival. Specifically, it prevents strong industries located in one state from using Congress to create a law that limits activity in a rival state's port. Under the Constitution, this clause, the states gave up their control of foreign trade and interstate trade. And port preference protects the right of the states from abuse by the powers that they surrendered. The Supreme Court has interpreted the Port Preference Clause, this Clause 6, to forbid Congress from blatantly discriminating between ports of one state and those of another. But it has allowed incidental preferences or unequal taxes. Most recently, Justice Thomas has argued that the most natural reading of port preference part of the clause was to forbid Congress from using its commerce power to channel commerce into one state's ports. Under current law, case law, Congress is on its honor to refrain from favoring one state's port over another's. Because of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6, this clause of the United States Constitution, we the people deny Congress the right to give advantages in shipping to one state over another. We the people get equal opportunity for commerce in all parts of the country. In an article from constitutioncenter.org, Eric M. Jensen says, many, and I quote, many in the founding generation were concerned that a strong national government might favor one part of the country over another. Both export and port preference clause provisions were responses to that concern. Another explanation of the export clause. A fundamental goal of the Constitutional Convention was to ensure that the national government could raise revenue, because requisitioning funds from the states under the Articles of Confederation had failed. Imports and exports were obvious revenue sources, and many delegates, like Alexander Hamilton, thought the government should be able to tax both. Southern delegates worried that taxes on exports would negatively affect their region and the staple states from most exports that came at that time. They didn't hide their fear that export taxation was making agricultural products like cotton more expensive and therefore less attractive. This in itself could be used to attack slavery. Export taxation was a deal breaker. Without restrictions, there would have been no Constitution. Taxation could conceivably have been limited to particular exported goods, but no agreement on details of that sort was forthcoming. At last attempt to permit taxation of exports failed to receive Southern support. That left the clause as we have it today. The export clause is packed with interpretive questions. By its terms, the prohibition isn't limited to levies that single out exports or that in fact would burden only part of the country. A national tax is invalid as applied to articles exported. Of course, articles export are defined as goods leaving the country, articles moving from one state to another that weren't being exported or imported. This clause, Clause 6, as it stands, is an absolute prohibition. The language doesn't seem to apply only to the national government, but rather to the section of the Constitution restricting what Congress can do. The Supreme Court emphasized that point in 1886 in interpreting the port preference clause. In any event, the import-export clause of Article 1, Section 10, Clause 6, this clause generally limits state taxation of exports as well. Courts have crafted rules to determine when a tax falls on articles exported. An income tax of general application isn't covered, even insofar as it reaches income from exports. On tax on goods at the pre-export stage is also a tax on goods at the pre-export stage is also permitted. But once goods enter a stream of commerce leading to exportation, the clause kicks in. A tax on windfall profits from mineral extraction would be permissible, even though some extracted minerals might ultimately be exported. Once headed for export, however, minerals couldn't be taxed. Stating these rules is easier than applying them, and the few judicial decisions interpreting the clause aren't models of clarity. The clause may be fuzzy, but it's not a dead letter. In any event, focusing on case law can give a misleading impression of a provision's significance. The most important effect of the export clause should be to deter Congress from enacting potentially problematic levies. Once again, the port preference clause was intended to constrain the national government's ability to favor ports in some states over ports in others. to the commercial benefit of the former. It wasn't a North versus South thing. That potential benefit was was most likely if the relevant states were neighbors like Virginia and Maryland and their ports competitors. Remember, this clause concerns the using of ports from one state to another. In other words, if there is a business in North Carolina using South Carolina ports to get there was just not acceptable. So that's what they're talking about here, is regulating which ports are used. So to go on once again, that potential benefit was most likely if the relevant states were neighbors like Virginia and Maryland and their ports competitors, like I was just saying, North Carolina or South Carolina. An example of particular concern was raised in late August by the Maryland delegation, as Luther Martin explained, and I quote, "Without such a provision, it would have been in the power of the general government to have compelled all ships sailing into or out of the Chesapeake to clear and enter at Norfolk or some port in Virginia, a regulation which would be extremely injurious to Maryland's commerce," unquote. Martin admitted it might be in the national interest to prefer Norfolk to make collecting import duties easier, but his delegation wanted to protect its parochial interests. Maryland got its way up to a point, but Martin, who became an anti-federalist, by the way, came to believe the clause didn't do enough to protect his state's prerogatives. Congress might satisfy the clause's literal requirements by limiting Maryland to one port as an inhospitable point on the Potomac, effectively requiring Baltimore shipping to stop in Virginia. Oh my! It's commerce, it's manufacturing, and the wars thereof. To go on, whether Martin was right in his interpretation isn't obvious, and it may not matter. Even without the clause, it's hard to imagine Congress considering legislation like his hypothetical today. Such a proposal might have been a non-starter in 1789. Congress can do many things that benefit particular states, but about which Clause 6 is silent. For example, sitting military bases have enormous economic consequences, but no provision requires uniform distribution of such facilities. Furthermore, courts have held that, consistent with Clause 6, this clause, Congress can incidentally benefit ports in one state but not in others by funding the infrastructure like bridges and lighthouses. So interpreted, the clause seems to have little effect today. That's particularly so if the term port is limited to its 18th century maritime meaning, not including the transportation hubs like airports. So even though the Constitution written when all of this was happening and they were setting up the states, the actual wording and the terms used are now a little bit different and have to be clarified. So there you have my research on Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6. My general understanding of this clause can be summed up with what Nelson Lund, a university professor of George Mason University School of Law, says, and I quote, "Congress is only on its honor to comply with the spirit of the clause by refraining from politically motivated favoritism that distorts the national economic competition among American ports." Now, in my general summary of all of this has to do with, literally has to do with commerce on the ports, whether either side. Of course, this was only on the eastern side of the United States when all this was put together, but it literally has to do with if a business was set up, and I'm in North Carolina, and I think in North and South Carolina. If the business was, say, for instance, in North Carolina, but one of the ports in North Carolina closest to the business was not able to bring in a ship, say, of a certain size to that port, and then that ship would have to go to South Carolina to unload its cargo. At that point, we're talking about taxes and duties, and whichever port it comes into, not only the federal tax and duties apply, but also state tax and duties. Even though the business owning the goods was in another state, then you had to pay the taxes of wherever you brought them in at. Now, at that time, it was rough. They were just developing these ports and putting all of this together. So they created Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6, which we're on today, to cover what was happening at that time. Once again, as I stated, this clause, though still in effect and still applicable for today, is not as black and white as it was back in the 1800s and 1700s when it was created. So they have to regulate based on terms and conditions and larger ports, the ability to bring different kinds of goods into different places, and the taxes that are set up. So there you have it. This is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6, and my research on that. Next week, I give you my research on Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, which states no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So once again, we have a whole discourse here in Section 9 about regulations put on Congress so that they didn't overstep their power and ability to make laws concerning different things. Yet they had to regulate certain things to allow monies to be put in order in the official setting up of the United States. So that's the way I understand it. So thank you for joining me. Once again, next week we'll talk about Clause 7. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's been long. Today is Wednesday. I won't be able to section things out so that you'll be able to listen. If you missed the news section of the show, it won't be available to re-listen unless you listen to the whole show. If you click on this show, it will be available to watch, but sectioned out won't be available till tomorrow. So God bless everybody. Thank you for joining me on Contemplating the Constitution. I tell you, I enjoy this research probably more than any research I've ever done in my life. I'm learning more from all of this stuff. I'm 66 years old and really wish, I told my wife yesterday, I really wish I'd have started on this about 30, 40 years ago, because I would have been real interested back then, but I didn't find it of importance back then. I do today, and it does apply today. So God bless everybody. Thank you for joining me on Contemplating the Constitution. And we'll see you next week, I hope.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.